The Varinthian Empire had ruled the Orion Spur for 12,000 years, and in all that time they had never once doubted their own greatness, their own power, their own right to look down upon every other species that crawled through the stars. Emperor Kelvos the Undying sat upon his throne of crystallized dark matter and watched as his servants prepared the grand nexus for the greatest gathering of powers the galaxy had seen in a century. And he smiled because he knew that every species that came to his station would bow before him and acknowledge that the Varinthians were the masters of all creation. Grand Nexus was not merely a space station, but rather a monument to imperial power, a structure the size of a small moon that floated in the void between three star systems and served as the heart of galactic diplomacy. And today, it would host the unveiling of the Empire's newest weapon ships arrived from every corner of known space and docked at the countless ports that lined the station's exterior like barnacles on some great metal whale. And from those ships came ambassadors and diplomats and merchants and spies, all eager to see what the Varinthians had created this time. The insectoid Kethra came in their hive ships, their compound eyes gleaming with curiosity and fear in equal measure. For they remembered what had happened to species that displeased the Empire, and they had no wish to join that list. The crystalline Morvani floated through the corridors in their gravity bubbles, their bodies catching the light and scattering it into rainbows across the walls. And they spoke in frequencies that most species could not hear, but all could feel as vibrations in their bones. The aquatic Drell arrived in their water-filled transport pods, their tentacles pressed against the transparent walls as they watched the other species with their large, dark eyes. And they wondered, as they always wondered, whether this gathering would bring peace or war. And then there were the humans' ambassador. Alira Vance stepped off the small transport vessel that had carried her delegation from Earth, and she paused for a moment to take in the sheer scale of the Grand Nexus, a structure so vast that it made her home planet look like a marble floating in an ocean. She was a tall woman with dark skin and silver hair that she kept pulled back in a tight braid, and her eyes were the color of storm clouds and just as difficult to read. And she wore the simple gray uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps with no medals or decorations, because humanity had not yet earned the right to wear such things in galactic society. Behind her came her small team of advisors and translators and security personnel, all of them aware that they were walking into a situation designed to humiliate them. All of them determined to endure whatever came with dignity and grace. Earth had only been spacefaring for 300 years, a mere heartbeat in galactic terms, and in the eyes of the Varinthian Empire, they were barely more than animals who had learned to build rockets. And the official classification they had been given was Emergent Species Class 7, which was the polite way of saying that they were permitted to exist but not to matter. Welcoming committee that met them at the docking port consisted of a single bored-looking Varinthian bureaucrat who barely glanced at their credentials before waving them toward the servants' corridor, not the main hall where the important delegations were being received with ceremony and respect. Alira said nothing and simply followed where she was directed, her face calm and her step steady. And if any of her team felt anger at this treatment, they kept it hidden behind masks of professional neutrality. The quarters they were given were small and located near the waste processing facilities, and the air had a faint chemical smell that made the younger members of the delegation wrinkle their noses in disgust. But Alira simply set down her bag and began to unpack as if she were staying in the finest suite on the station. That evening, the grand ceremony began in the Hall of Echoes, a chamber so large that clouds formed near its ceiling and the far walls were lost in a kind of indoor haze. And every species that held any power in the galaxy had sent representatives to fill the thousands of seats that rose in tiers Around the central stage, the human delegation was seated in the very back row, so far from the stage that they needed to use magnification devices to see what was happening. And the seats on either side of them were empty, because no one wanted to be seen sitting next to the primitives from the frontier high. Admiral Thyrek Voss strode onto the stage with the confidence of a being who had never known defeat. His scales gleaming under the lights and his ceremonial armor polished to a mirror shine. And when he spoke, his voice was amplified to fill every corner of that vast space. He told them of the glory of the Varinthian fleet and the countless victories it had won across the millennia. And he showed them holographic images of battles fought and worlds conquered enemies, reduced to ash and memory, and then he unveiled the newest jewel in the Imperial crown, a dreadnought-class warship called the Silence of Worlds. And the hologram that appeared above the stage showed a vessel so massive and so heavily armed that several of the smaller delegations actually gasped in fear. The ship was beautiful, in the way that a predator is beautiful, all sleek lines and deadly purpose. And its weapon systems were described in loving detail by the High Admiral, who clearly took great personal pride in every instrument of destruction that bristled from its hull. The assembled aliens murmured inappropriate awe, and the Emperor smiled from his private box high above the stage, pleased that his subjects understood their place in the natural order of things. And then High Admiral Thyrek noticed the humans in the back row, their magnification devices pressed to their eyes as they tried to see what everyone else could see clearly. And a cruel smile spread across his face, raised one clawed hand and pointed directly at the human delegation, and his voice boomed across the chamber. "Tell me, little mammals, does your species still propel vessels with chemical fire? And how many of your warships could fit inside one of our cargo bays?" Laughter erupted throughout the Hall of Echoes. Thousands of voices from dozens of species, all finding amusement in the same joke at humanity's expense. And the sound washed over the human delegation like a wave of contempt. Ambassador Vance lowered her magnification device and looked at the High Admiral across that vast distance. And though he could not possibly see her expression at such range, she smiled because she knew something that he did not, something that none of them knew, something that waited in the darkness above the station with patience that had been cultivated over millennia in orbit high above the Grand Nexus, hidden from every scanner and sensor that the combined technology of galactic civilization could produce. Something vast and ancient and impossibly powerful drifted in the cold silence of space. It had no running lights, and it made no transmissions, and it gave off no heat signature that any instrument could detect. And it had been waiting in that darkness for a very long time, and inside that darkness, in chambers that had not held warmth for 40,000 years, systems began to stir, and lights began to flicker, and something that had been sleeping for longer than the Varinthian Empire had existed began to dream of waking. This human smiled and endured the laughter of the galaxy, and they waited for the moment that was coming, the moment when everything would change. The diplomatic summit continued for 3 days, and each day brought fresh humiliation for the human delegation, as if the Varinthian Empire had made it their personal mission to remind humanity of its place at the very bottom of galactic society. On the first day they were seated at what the other delegations openly called the Children's Table, a small platform in the corner of the banquet hall where the food was served cold and the drinks were watered down, and the servants pretended not to hear when the humans asked for anything. On the second day, a group of young Varinthian nobles accidentally spilled an entire pitcher of fermented nectar on Ambassador Vance's uniform, and they laughed as she stood there dripping with the sticky purple liquid, and they did not apologize because apologizing to a human would have been beneath their dignity. On the third day, the official documents for a minor trade agreement were distributed to all the delegations, And when the humans looked at the section describing Earth's territory, they found it listed not as human space or even Earth territory, but simply as unclaimed frontier space. As if their entire civilization did not exist at all through all of this. Ambassador Alira Vance remained calm and patient and polite. And she smiled at the insults and nodded at the slights and never once raised her voice in anger or protest. Her staff watched her with a mixture of admiration and confusion, wondering how she could endure such treatment without breaking. Wondering if perhaps she had simply given up and accepted that humanity would forever be the joke of the galaxy. But Alira had not given up, and she was far from broken. And on the evening of the third day, she finally made her move. She requested a formal audience with High Admiral Thyric Voss. Using all the proper channels and following all the correct protocols. And she submitted her request through the official diplomatic systems so that everyone would know what she had done. The High Admiral granted her request because refusing would have shown weakness. And also because he was curious what the little human could possibly want. And he arranged for the meeting to take place in the Grand Forum, where all the delegations could watch the primitive grovel before him. The Grand Forum was a circular chamber with rising tiers of seats surrounding a central speaking platform. And by the time Alira arrived, every seat was filled with curious onlookers, eager to see what entertainment the humans would provide. High Admiral Thyric stood on the platform in his full ceremonial armor, his scales polished and his claws sharpened, and his expression one of amused contempt as he watched the human ambassador walk toward him. Alira climbed the steps to the platform and stood before him, a small figure in her simple gray uniform facing a being twice her height, whose species had conquered 1,000 worlds while humanity was still learning to make fire. The Admiral looked down at her with his golden reptilian eyes, and his voice dripped with condescension as he spoke. "You wish to address me, human, so speak your piece and let us all hear what wisdom the primitives have to offer." Alira did not flinch, and she did not bow, and she did not lower her eyes as lesser species were expected to do in the presence of Varinthian nobility. And when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady and carried to every corner of the chamber. She said, "The Varinthian Empire claims supremacy in all things naval, and I have heard your admirals boast that no ship in the galaxy can match your fleet. And I have seen the holographic displays of your mighty dreadnought and listened to the gasps of fear from the assembled powers. And I wonder if perhaps you would be willing to prove these claims." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd, because no one had expected the human to challenge the Empire. And High Admiral Thyric's eyes narrowed as he tried to understand what game this creature was playing. Asked her what exactly she was proposing, and Alira smiled and told him she proposed a demonstration. A test of naval engineering between one human ship and one Varinthian ship, with no crews aboard either vessel, so that only artificial intelligence would guide them. A pure contest of technology against technology with nothing to cloud the results. The challenge would take place at Kessler's Maw, a notorious debris field on the edge of the system where shattered asteroids and destroyed ships created a maze of danger that would test any vessel's ability to navigate and evade and eliminate targets. If the Varinthian ship won, then Earth would surrender all territorial claims beyond their own solar system, and humanity would officially accept permanent status as a client species of the Empire. But if the human ship won, then the Varinthians would address humanity as equals and grant them full recognition as a sovereign power. High Admiral Thyric stared at the human woman, and for a moment he was speechless, because the audacity of this challenge was beyond anything he had expected. And then he began to laugh. He laughed so hard that tears streamed from his golden eyes and his armored shoulders shook with mirth. And the entire Grand Forum erupted in laughter along with him, because the idea of a human ship defeating a Varinthian vessel was the funniest thing any of them had ever When he finally recovered enough to speak, he asked Alira if she was serious, if she truly believed that anything humanity had built could survive for even a moment against Varinthian engineering. And she simply nodded and said, yes. The Kethra delegates clicked their mandibles in what might have been concern or might have been anticipation, and the Marvani flickered with colors that indicated they were calculating odds and finding them very much not in humanity's favor. And the Drell pressed their tentacles against their pods and watched with their large, dark eyes that revealed nothing of their thoughts. High Admiral Thyric accepted the challenge because he could not refuse without looking afraid, and because he genuinely believed that this would be the final humiliation that would break the humans forever, and because he wanted to personally witness the moment when their pathetic little ship was reduced to atoms. The wager was set for the following cycle, and the news spread across the station within hours. And betting pools opened throughout the Grand Nexus with odds against humanity set at 10,000 to 1. That night, Ambassador Vance returned to her small quarters near the waste processing facilities, and she dismissed her staff and locked herself in her private room. And she sat down at a communication terminal that looked ordinary, but was anything but ordinary. She composed a message using encryption protocols that predated the Varinthian Empire by millennia. Codes that no species in the known galaxy could break because no species in the known galaxy even knew they existed. The message was very short. Just a single phrase followed by a set of coordinates. And she transmitted it toward a point in space where nothing visible existed. A point in the darkness above the station where sensors detected only empty void. The message read, Lazarus Protocol activated. You are cleared to WAKN. The cold silence of space, the message reached its destination and was received and decoded by systems that had not processed new information in 40,000 years. And in the heart of that vast hidden darkness, something stirred. Lights flickered in corridors that had known only blackness for millennia, and power began to flow through conduits designed by hands that had turned to dust before the first Varinthian learned to walk upright. And a consciousness that was older than the stars began to remember what it was. The humans had made their challenge, and the Empire had accepted. And now the galaxy would learn what humanity had kept hidden for 300 years. The secret that slept in the darkness, the weapon that waited in the void. Tomorrow everything would change. The entire Grand Nexus gathered to watch the competition, and every viewing gallery on the station was packed with spectators. Thousands of beings from dozens of species, all pressing against windows and crowding around holographic displays to witness what they believed would be humanity's final humiliation. The betting pools had grown to obscene proportions overnight, and fortunes were being wagered on the outcome. Though everyone wagered on the same outcome, because no one truly believed the humans had any chance of winning. High Admiral Thyric stood in the Imperial observation deck surrounded by his officers and advisors. And he sipped from a goblet of wine and smiled the smile of someone who knew exactly how the next hour would unfold. The Varinthian entry glided into the designated staging area with the grace of a hunting bird. A destroyer-class vessel called Twilight's Edge that was considered small by Imperial standards, but was still more than enough to crush anything humanity could produce. The ship was beautiful in a deadly way, with a hull of quantum state armor that could shift its molecular structure to absorb or deflect any known weapon, and engines that could outrun light itself, and targeting systems that could track a grain of sand. Across a solar system it moved like liquid silver through the void, and even the representatives of other species who hated the Empire could not help but admire the elegance of Varinthian engineering. And then the human ship arrived. It did not emerge from hyperspace like a normal vessel, and it did not accelerate into the arena from some hidden position, but rather it simply appeared as if reality had folded itself aside to make room for something that should not exist. One moment there was empty space, and the next moment there was a ship. And the gravitational sensors throughout the system screamed in confusion as they tried to process what had just happened. The vessel that hung in the void was enormous, far larger than Twilight's Edge, far larger than anything humanity should have been able to build, far larger than the dreadnought that the Empire had unveiled just days before. But size was not what made the observers fall silent. The ship was old, impossibly old, with a hull scarred by damage from weapons that no living species recognized. And its surface was covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly. Patterns that hurt the eyes and confused the mind. The Varinthian tactical systems attempted to scan the vessel and returned only errors and corrupted data, as if the ship existed in some way that their sensors could not comprehend. As if it was built according to principles that defied the laws of physics as the galaxy understood them. High Admiral Thurik's smile faded, and his goblet slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, spilling wine like blood across the polished deck. The ship's identification beacon activated and broadcast in a format so ancient that most translation systems could not even recognize it as language. But the Nexus computers struggled and strained and finally produced a translation VSAL. Designation: Use Prometheus Classification. Contingency Class Deep Void Dreadnought. Commission Date: Classified beyond Imperial Clearance. Crew Complement: None required. Current status: Fully operational. And AWAK. High Admiral Thurik's voice cracked as he demanded answers through the communication systems, shouting at the human delegation and asking where they had found this ship and what trick they were playing. Ambassador Vance's reply came through clear and calm and simple. We did not find it anywhere, Admiral. We built it. In the viewing galleries, the Kethra delegates began to leave their seats, their compound eyes wide and their wings buzzing with frequencies that indicated pure terror, because something in the design of that ship triggered ancient memories buried deep in their collective consciousness. The Morvani ambassador's crystalline form flickered with colors that had no name in any known language, colors that indicated emotions so primitive and so powerful that their species had no words for them. And the eldest among them began to keen in a frequency that shattered nearby glass. They recognized something in those geometric patterns, something from stories so old that they had been dismissed as myth. Stories about a time before the Varinthian Empire, before the Kethra hives, before the Morvani achieved sentience. Stories about a species that had walked among the stars when the galaxy was young. The Drell pressed their tentacles against their pods, and their large dark eyes showed something that none of their trading partners had ever seen. The fear, genuine primal fear of the kind that evolution builds into prey animals to help them survive the competition. Began Twilight's Edge surged forward into the debris field with all the speed and grace that Varinthian engineering could provide, weaving between shattered asteroids and spinning wrecks with precision that would have earned applause under any other circumstances. Prometheus did not move like that. The Prometheus moved like reality was asking its permission, like the laws of physics were suggestions rather than rules, like space itself bent around the vessel rather than the vessel moving through space. It did not dodge the debris because the debris was simply not where the ship wanted to be. And it did not accelerate because acceleration implied that it was subject to the normal constraints of velocity. And Twilight's Edge reached the first target zone and opened fire with weapons that could crack open a small moon, energy beams that burned hotter than the core of a star, lancing out to destroy the designated practice targets. The Prometheus reached its first target zone and did something that no one in the viewing galleries could understand or explain. It looked at the targets that was the only way to describe what happened. Those ships do not have eyes and cannot look at anything, and yet every observer felt in some deep instinctive way that the Prometheus had turned its attention toward those targets and found them wanting. The targets ceased to exist. They did not explode, and they did not burn, and they did not shatter into pieces. They simply stopped being there, as if they had never existed at all. As if reality had decided that those particular arrangements of matter were no longer permitted. High Admiral Thyric screamed orders at his tactical officers, demanding to know what weapon had been used and how to counter it. And they stared at their displays with blank expressions and admitted that they had no idea because their sensors had detected nothing. No energy discharge, no projectile, no radiation of any kind. The two ships raced through the debris field toward the final confrontation zone where they would face each other directly. And Twilight's Edge pushed its engines beyond their rated limits because its eye had calculated the odds and reached a conclusion that no Varinthian had ever imagined possible. The Varinthian ship was afraid. At the center of the debris field, the two vessels came to face each other across a gap of empty space, and Twilight's Edge raised every weapon it possessed and prepared to fire everything at once in a desperate attempt to destroy the human ship before it could do whatever it had done to those targets. The Prometheus simply waited. Twilight's Edge fired, and beams of energy and missiles and kinetic projectiles and weapons that bent gravity itself all streaked toward the human vessel in a storm of destruction that could have leveled a continent. None of it arrived. The weapons' fire simply vanished to somewhere between the two ships, absorbed or deflected or erased by something that the Varinthian sensors could not detect or measure or understand. Then the Prometheus responded. The ship did not fire any weapon that the observers could identify, did not launch any projectile or generate any beam, did not do anything that looked like an attack at all. It simply looked at Twilight's Edge with that terrible attention that was not attention, that focus that was not focus, that regard that was something far older and far stranger than any weapon the galaxy had ever known. And Twilight's Edge ceased to exist in 43 seconds, not destroyed in the conventional sense, but unmade, broken down into particles so fine that they registered only as a slight increase in background radiation, erased from the universe so completely that not even debris remained. The viewing galleries fell silent. High Admiral Thyric collapsed into his chair with his scales pale and his eyes wide and his hands trembling, and he whispered words that no one had ever heard a Varinthian speak before. What have we awakened? What have we challenged? What are they? In her small quarters near the waste processing facilities, Ambassador Alira Vance watched the competition on a small display screen, and she allowed herself a single moment of satisfaction before composing her expression back into professional neutrality. The mockery had ended. The real conversation was about to begin. The Grand Nexus descended into chaos in the hours following the competition as species that had spent millennia maintaining careful diplomatic composure suddenly found themselves unable to hide their fear and confusion and desperate need for answers. Emperor Kelvos the Undying, who had not personally attended a Galactic Concord session in 8,000 years, emerged from his private chambers and demanded that an emergency assembly be convened immediately. Within hours, every delegation on the station had crowded into the Hall of Echoes, the same chamber where High Admiral Thyric had mocked humanity just days before, and the mood was very different now. The Varinthian fleet had mobilized, and 100 warships now surrounded the Grand Nexus in a defensive formation, their weapons charged and their crews terrified because they had all watched what happened to Twilight's Edge, and they knew their ships would fare no better. The Chio Kethra demanded to know what ancient evil the humans had awakened and whether the galaxy was now in danger. their mandibles clicking in patterns that indicated barely controlled panic. The Morvani asked questions in frequencies that most translators could not process. Questions about timelines and civilizations and extinction events that had occurred. Before their own species achieved awareness, the Drow said nothing, but their tentacles never stopped moving. Restless and afraid, and their large dark eyes tracked the human delegation with an intensity that spoke of prey. Watching a Predator ambassador, Alira Vance, walked alone to the central platform where she had issued her challenge. And she stood before the assembled powers of the galaxy and waited for them to stop shouting. Emperor Kelvus himself addressed her from his throne high above the chamber floor. His voice amplified to fill the space, and for the first time in his long life, he spoke to a human without contempt. He said, "You will explain yourself. You will tell us what that ship is and where it came from and what humanity intends to do with such power. And you will do so now." Alira looked up at the Emperor, and she looked around at the thousands of frightened faces watching her from every tier of the hall, and she nodded slowly before she began to speak. She told them the truth in the year 2157. By Earth's calendar, a team of researchers had been drilling through the ice of Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter, searching for signs of microbial life in the subsurface ocean. Instead, they found metal. They found a ship buried under kilometers of ice, a vessel so large that their initial scans mistook it for a geological formation. And when they finally cut their way inside, they discovered that it was old, impossibly old, older than anything they had ever imagined. The ship's computer systems still functioned despite millennia of dormancy. And when Earth scientists finally cracked the encryption on those systems, they learned the truth about their own species. Humanity had not always been primitive. Humanity had walked among the stars before. Long ago, in a civilization that had risen and flourished, and then fallen so completely that not even legends remained. A civilization that had built ships like the Prometheus and mastered technologies that the modern galaxy could not comprehend. 40,000 years ago, long before the Varinthian Empire came to power, long before the Kethra developed spaceflight, long before the Morvani achieved sentience, humanity had been one of the great powers of the galaxy. And then something had happened, something terrible. Something that the records on the Prometheus referred to only as the Long Dark. And that first human civilization had fallen, and their knowledge had been lost, and their descendants had crawled back down to Earth and forgotten everything. But they had not forgotten everything before the end. They had built ships like the Prometheus and hidden them throughout the solar system. Bunkers of technology and knowledge and power designed to survive whatever was coming. Designed to wait until humanity rose again. Designed to give their descendants a fighting chance. Alira paused and let the weight of this revelation settle over the assembly. Before she continued, she told them that humanity had not announced this discovery because they were afraid. Afraid of how the galaxy would react. Afraid that older species would try to take this technology for themselves. Afraid that they would be conquered or destroyed before they had a chance to understand what they had found. So they had kept the secret for 300 years. Earth's governments had studied the Prometheus and learned from its systems and quietly built more ships like it in hidden shipyards scattered through the outer reaches of the solar system. 17 more ships now waited in the darkness. Each one as powerful as the Prometheus, each one fully operational, each one crewed by artificial intelligences that had been running simulations and preparing for combat for centuries. She looked directly at Emperor Kelvos, and her voice was quiet. But every word carried to every corner of that vast hall. She said, "You see us as children because we are young and small and our history is short. And you mock us because our ships are primitive and our technology is laughable and our place in the galaxy is insignificant. But you forget what we are." She took a step forward, and her eyes never left the Emperor's face. She said, "We are the species that invented war before we invented writing. The species that split the atom before we learned to live in peace. The species that reached for the stars while we were still killing each other over patches of dirt. Her voice rose and filled the chamber with a passion that made the translators struggle to keep up, she said. We are the species that refused to die when the long dark came, that crawled back up from nothing and rebuilt everything. That reached for the stars a second time, because giving up was never an option. She spread her arms to encompass the entire assembly. Every species and every delegation and every being that had laughed at humanity, she said. Our ancestors walked among you when your empires were still pond scum, and when they fell, they left us the keys to rise again. And we have risen, and we are here, and we will not be mocked any longer. The silence that followed was absolute. Ella lowered her arms, and her voice returned to its normal, calm, professional tone. She said, We do not want war. We never did. We came to this summit hoping to find a place among you through diplomacy and trade and mutual respect. But you offered us only contempt and humiliation and cruelty. She looked around at the assembled powers, and something in her expression made even the Varinthian guards step back. She said, We are prepared to forget that now. We are prepared to start fresh and build relationships based on equality and respect. But if the galaxy insists on treating us as prey, then the galaxy should understand what it is hunting. As if in answer to her words, the viewing screens throughout the hall flickered and changed, showing the space above the Grand Nexus where the Prometheus now held position directly overhead. The ship that had been hiding in the darkness was now visible to every sensor on the station, and it hung there in the void like a predator watching its prey. Patient and powerful and absolutely terrifying Ambassador Vance clasped her hands behind her back and waited for the galaxy to decide what it wanted to do. Emperor Calvos stared at the human woman for a long moment, and then he did something that no Varinthian emperor had done in 12,000 years of history, inclined his head in acknowledgement of an equal. The aftermath of the revelation reshaped galactic politics in ways that would have seemed impossible just days before. And species that had spent millennia competing for power suddenly found themselves united by a mixture of fear and fascination, and grudging respect for the small planet called Earth. Emperor Calvos the Undying issued a formal apology to humanity. The first such apology in the entire history of the Varinthian Empire, and he personally signed the documents that reclassified Earth's status from Emergent Species Class 7 to something entirely new. The official designation was Elder Inheritors, a classification that had never been used before because it had never been needed. A category created specifically for a species that had once been great and fallen and risen again from the ashes of their own. Forgotten Glory High Admiral Thyric Voss resigned his commission in disgrace, unable to bear the shame of having mocked the very species whose ancestors had been building dreadnoughts while the Varinthians were still learning to use tools. And he retreated to his family estate where he would spend the rest of his days studying human history and wondering how he could have been so blind. The Cathara were the first to petition for a formal alliance with Earth, their hive queens recognizing that the winds of galactic power had shifted, and that being friends with the humans was far preferable to being their enemies. They offered technology and trade and military cooperation, and in return they asked only that humanity remember them kindly when the balance of power finally tipped. And Ambassador Vance accepted their offer with grace and genuine warmth. The Morvani shared ancient records that had been locked away in their crystal archives for longer than anyone could remember. Records that confirmed what the humans had revealed about their lost civilization. Those records spoke of a species called the Terrans who had been artists and warriors and explorers, a people who had spread across the galaxy with a hunger for knowledge and experience that made them both beloved and feared. A civilization that had burned so bright that even 40,000 years later, their light still echoed in the memories of species that had known them the records also hinted at what had brought the Terrans down. References to something called the Darkness. Beyond that had come from outside the galaxy and swept through civilized space like a plague, destroying everything in its path until only scattered remnants remained. The Morvani offered these records freely and asked nothing in return, except the chance to stand beside humanity when the darkness returned, because their oldest prophecies suggested that it would return, that it always returned, and that only the Terrans had ever known how to fight it. The Drell simply asked very politely to never be on the opposite side of any conflict that involved Earth, and they backed up this request with trade agreements so generous that Earth's economists thought there must be some mistake. There was no mistake. The Drell had long memories, and their historians had preserved fragments of stories about the Terrans, stories about what happened to species that opposed them, stories about worlds that no longer existed and peoples whose names have been erased from history. They had no intention of adding their own species to that list, but the changes within humanity itself were perhaps more profound than anything happening in galactic politics, because the existence of the Prometheus fleet could no longer be kept secret from Earth's own people. The governments of Earth held a joint announcement that was broadcast to every screen and every speaker and every communication device on the planet. And for the first time in 300 years, the truth was told. The people of Earth learned that their leaders had been preparing for this moment since before any of them were born, building ships in secret shipyards hidden in the outer darkness, training crews and developing strategies and waiting for the day when the mask would have to come off. Some were angry about the secrecy and demanded to know what other secrets their governments were keeping, but most understood why it had been necessary, why Earth could not have revealed its power until humanity was ready to use it. Admiral Chun Wei, commander of the Prometheus and the oldest continuously operating artificial intelligence in human space, gave a rare interview to the press corps that had been granted access to the ship. She appeared on their screens as a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and steel gray hair, though of course she was not really a woman at all, but rather a projection created by systems that had been designed by hands that had turned to dust 40 millennia ago. When they asked her if humanity was now the dominant power in the galaxy, she shook her head slowly. She said, "We are not here to dominate anyone. Our ancestors tried that once, and look where it got them. Buried under ice and forgotten by time and reduced to savages who had to discover fire all over again." She paused, and her expression grew serious. She said, "We are here to make sure that when the next great darkness comes, and it will come because it always comes, someone is still standing, someone remembers how to fight, someone refuses to go quietly into extinction." The interview ended and Admiral Chun returned to her duties aboard the Prometheus, running simulations and analyzing data and preparing for a war that she hoped would never come, but knew in her ancient circuits was inevitable. Ambassador Illyra Vance returned to Earth as a hero, greeted by crowds and celebrations and offers of positions in government that would have made her the most powerful person on the planet. She declined them all. She had work to do, work that could not be done from a politician's office or a general's command center, work that required someone who understood both the promise and the danger of what humanity had inherited. In her private office deep beneath the surface of the Earth, she reviewed the classified reports that even most government officials were not permitted to see. The full records recovered from the Prometheus, the complete history of the first human civilization and its fall. The Prometheus had not been the only thing sleeping beneath Europa's ice. There had been records, detailed records that explained why the first human civilization had built ships like the Prometheus in the first place. Records that described the enemy they had been fighting. Records that made even Admiral Chun's ancient systems experience something that might have been called fear something. was coming something from outside the galaxy, from the void between the stars, from the darkness that existed before light. Something that had destroyed the first human civilization and countless others before it. Something that slept for millennia between its hunts, but always woke eventually. Always returned, always hungry. The records called it many names in many languages. But the translation that Alira found most chilling was simply the silence. Because that was what it left behind. Empty space where living worlds had once been. Quiet stars where voices had once sung. Nothing where everything had once existed. The first humans had fought the silence and lost. But before they fell, they had prepared for this day. They had built ships and hidden knowledge and left instructions for their descendants. They had done everything they could to give humanity a second chance. Alira closed the classified files and sat alone in the darkness of her office, thinking about the weight that now rested on humanity's shoulders. The responsibility they had inherited along with those terrible, beautiful ships. Outside her window, the stars shone cold and distant. And somewhere out there in the void between galaxies, something ancient was stirring. Something that had slept for 40,000 years and was beginning to dream of waking. The galaxy had mocked humanity for being young and weak and primitive. But the galaxy did not understand what humanity really was. Humanity was not the inheritor of a lost golden age. Humanity was the last line of defense against the darkness that had devoured civilizations beyond counting. The final hope of a galaxy that did not even know it was in danger. The answer to a question that had been asked 40,000 years ago by ancestors who had given everything to make sure their children would survive. And now, finally, humanity was ready. The Prometheus hung in orbit above the Earth, its ancient systems humming with power, its weapons armed and its sensors scanning the endless dark, watching and waiting for the enemy that was coming. The mockery had ended. The war was about to begin.